Hey guys, tonight we're descending into one of history's most brutal survival challenges, how prisoners in medieval dungeons managed to sleep without freezing to death in cells that were basically stone refrigerators designed by sadists. You're about to discover that staying alive through a winter night in a medieval dungeon required more ingenuity than most people use in their entire modern lives, and honestly you probably wouldn't survive your first night. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself standing at the top of a narrow stone staircase, the kind that spirals down into darkness so complete it seems to swallow sound itself. You're about to enter a world where the very walls breathe cold against your skin, where frost forms on stone, even when there's no wind, where the air itself feels thick enough to freeze in your lungs. This is the medieval dungeon, and tonight you're not just visiting, you're staying. The first thing that hits you as you descend is the smell. It's not just dampness or decay, though those are certainly there. It's the particular odour of stone that has never known warmth mixed with the metallic tang of iron and something else. Something that makes your primitive brain whisper warnings about danger. The temperature drops with each step, and by the time you reach the bottom, your breath is visible in the dim torchlight. Medieval dungeons weren't accidentally cold. They were deliberately built to break the human spirit through constant grinding discomfort. But what their architects didn't fully anticipate was how this design would create genuine survival challenges that went far beyond psychological torture. These underground chambers became ice traps where the stone itself acted like a massive heat sink, absorbing any warmth and radiating cold with the efficiency of a medieval air conditioning system running in reverse. You run your hand along the wall and immediately jerk it back. The stone isn't just cold, it's actively hostile, seeming to pull heat from your palm like a vampire draining life. The mortar between the blocks has collected moisture that freezes and thaws in endless cycles, creating tiny crystals that glitter in the torchlight like a beautiful deadly warning. Now imagine this is your bedroom for the next several months or years, or however long your captors decide you deserve to suffer. The cell door clangs shut behind you, and suddenly the challenge becomes crystal clear. How do you sleep in a place designed to steal your body heat, when sleep itself might mean never waking up again? You discover quickly that medieval dungeon architecture followed a philosophy of maximum suffering through minimum effort. The designers weren't just building prisons, they were engineering environments where the very structure would do most of the torturing for them. Every element seemed calculated to make survival as difficult as possible, while keeping prisoners technically alive enough to serve their sentences. The walls around you stretch upward into shadows, built from massive stone blocks that were quarried specifically for their density. Dense stone holds cold longer and more efficiently than lighter materials, creating what amounts to a natural refrigeration system. These blocks, often 2 feet thick or more, formed an impenetrable barrier between you and any hope of external warmth. But worse than that, they created a thermal mass that would absorb heat during any brief warm periods, and then slowly release that coldness back into the cell for hours afterward. The floors present their own special form of misery. Made from fitted stone slabs, they conduct heat away from your body the moment you make contact. Lying directly on these floors in winter meant losing body heat faster than your metabolism could replace it, a one-way ticket to hypothermia. The stones were often slightly damp from condensation, and water conducts heat away from skin 25 times faster than air. Even standing barefoot on these floors for more than a few minutes could begin the process of frostbite in your toes. Medieval builders understood that underground meant colder, but they may not have fully grasped the science behind why their dungeons became such effective ice chambers. Underground chambers stay cooler than surface buildings because they're surrounded by earth that maintains a relatively constant temperature, usually around 50 degrees Fahrenheit in most European climates. While 50 degrees sounds survivable, it becomes deadly when you're trying to sleep in it night after night, especially when combined with dampness and poor nutrition. The ceiling height in most dungeons was deliberately low, creating a sense of oppression, but this design choice accidentally made heating even more challenging. Low ceilings meant less air volume to warm, but they also created better conditions for heat stratification. Any warm air would rise quickly to the ceiling and stay there, leaving the sleeping level perpetually cold. You might feel slightly warmer standing up, but lying down meant dropping into the coldest layer of air in the cell. Ventilation systems, when they existed at all, were minimal, perhaps a small grate or opening that allowed just enough air circulation to prevent suffocation, while ensuring that any heat generated would be constantly swept away. These openings often faced north or were positioned to catch prevailing winds, turning them into efficient heat extraction systems that would pull warmth from the cell like chimneys in reverse. The psychological effect of this architecture was perhaps as devastating as the physical impact. Being surrounded by stone creates a particular kind of claustrophobia, where every surface around you feels hostile and unyielding. The cold becomes not just a physical sensation, but an omnipresent entity that seems to seep into your thoughts. Medieval chroniclers described prisoners who claimed the stones themselves seemed to watch them radiating malevolence, along with their endless chill. Historians still argue whether this level of architectural cruelty was intentional, or simply a side effect of building practical underground chambers. Some evidence suggests that dungeon designers did consider the psychological impact of their choices, while others point to purely functional concerns like structural integrity and cost efficiency. Either way, the result was the same spaces that challenged human survival in fundamental ways. But here's what's remarkable. People did survive these conditions night after night, month after month. They found ways to outwit architecture specifically designed to defeat them, developing survival strategies that would make modern wilderness experts take notes. The first thing you learn about surviving a medieval dungeon is that your bed isn't really a bed. It's a puzzle that might determine whether you see another sunrise. When prisoners arrived at their stone accommodations, they were typically provided with what guards generously called bedding, though this bore little resemblance to anything you'd recognize as sleep-worthy furniture. Your mattress consists of loose straw scattered directly onto the stone floor, often mixed with hay-dried rushes or whatever organic material the guards could acquire cheaply. This straw serves multiple purposes beyond simple cushioning. It creates a thin barrier between your body and the heat-sucking stone floor, acts as insulation to trap small pockets of warm air, and provides material that you can manipulate to create better sleeping configurations. But here's where survival ingenuity kicks in. Smart prisoners quickly learn that straw arrangement isn't random. It's an art form that can mean the difference between waking up with frostbite or waking up at all. You gather the straw into a thick nest, compacting it enough to create a substantial barrier, but leaving it loose enough to trap air. The goal is creating what modern survivalists would recognize as a primitive sleeping system that elevates your body core away from the thermal drain of stone. The most experienced prisoners develop techniques for straw management that would impress professional outdoorsmen. They learn to replace the bottom layer regularly since compressed straw loses its insulating properties. They discover that certain types of hay hold warmth better than others. barley straw, for instance, creates better air pockets than wheat straw. Some prisoners even learn to weave straw into thicker mats, creating more substantial barriers that could be rolled up during the day and spread out at night. Beyond straw, prisoners collect every scrap of fabric they can acquire, beg, steal, or trade for. A torn piece of burlap becomes a blanket. Rags from clothing become extra layers. Even scraps of rope or hemp can be unraveled and used as insulation. The smart prisoners learn to layer these materials strategically, understanding that multiple thin layers trap more warm air than single thick layers. Some prisoners become remarkably creative with their limited resources. They stuff straw into makeshift fabric pouches, creating primitive pillows that keep their heads off the stone. They learn to position larger rocks around their sleeping areas to block drafts not comfortable, but effective at creating windbreaks in drafty cells. Guards often turned a blind eye to these modifications, partly out of mercy, and partly because dead prisoners created paperwork problems. The most resourceful prisoners develop what amount to complete bedding systems built from scraps. They create mattress foundations from bundled straw insulation layers from cloth scraps, and even primitive blankets by sewing together pieces of fabric with threads pulled from their own clothing. These prison beds might look like piles of garbage to modern eyes, but they represent sophisticated understanding of heat retention and thermal dynamics. Cleanliness becomes a survival issue rather than a comfort preference. Dirty straw and fabric harbour moisture, which dramatically reduces their insulating properties. Prisoners learn to air out their bedding whenever possible, spreading straw in whatever sunlight might filter into their cells, and beating fabric scraps to remove accumulated moisture and parasites. But the real innovation comes in understanding that your bed isn't just where you sleep, it's your primary defense system against an environment trying to kill you. The most successful prisoners treat bedding construction like a daily survival task, constantly adjusting, improving, and adapting their sleeping arrangements based on weather changes, available materials, and hard-learned lessons about what works in their particular cell's microclimate. When you're trapped in a stone icebox with other human beings, you quickly discover that body heat becomes the most valuable currency in your frozen economy. Medieval prisoners developed an entire social system around the strategic sharing of warmth, where sleeping arrangements could literally determine who lived through the night and who didn't make it to morning. The mathematics of survival are brutally simple. A single human body generates about as much heat as a 100-watt light bulb, but that heat dissipates rapidly in cold stone chambers. Two bodies pressed together, however, can create a microclimate that's survivable. 3 or 4 bodies can generate enough combined warmth to actually achieve something resembling comfort. This wasn't about intimacy or personal preference. This was about turning human metabolism into a heating system. Prisoners quickly learned to organize themselves into sleeping configurations that maximize shared warmth while minimizing heat loss. The most common arrangement was what modern survivalists call spooning, where prisoners would lie pressed together in a line sharing body heat along their entire length. The person in the middle received warmth from both sides while those on the ends rotated positions throughout the night to ensure everyone got time in the warmer center spots. But this system created its own social dynamics and survival politics. Larger prisoners generated more heat, but also required more space and resources. Smaller prisoners took up less room but contributed less warmth to the group. Sick prisoners might need extra warmth to survive but couldn't contribute much heat themselves. These calculations led to difficult decisions about who got included in the warm sleeping groups and who might be left to manage on their own. The most successful prison groups developed rotation systems where sleeping positions changed throughout the night. Guards often noted the strange choreography of prisoners who would wake periodically and shift positions like dancers performing a slow, silent ballet of survival. These movements weren't random, they were carefully orchestrated to ensure that no one person spent the entire night exposed to the coldest positions. Some prisoners became particularly skilled at reading body heat signatures and understanding who made the best sleeping partners for different conditions. Young prisoners often generated more heat but slept more restlessly. Older prisoners might sleep more soundly but generated less warmth. Sick prisoners sometimes ran fevers that made them valuable heat sources, though at the cost of potential contagion that could endanger the entire group. The sharing of warmth extended beyond just body heat. Prisoners learned to pool their fabric scraps and bedding materials, creating communal sleeping systems that covered entire groups rather than individual beds. A single blanket might cover 3 prisoners lying close together, while their combined straw bedding created a larger, more effective thermal barrier than individual sleeping areas. Trust became a crucial survival factor in these arrangements. Sleeping pressed against another person required a level of vulnerability that went beyond physical intimacy. You were literally trusting someone else with your life, knowing that they could steal your warmth, your bedding, or even harm you while you slept. The prisoners who survived longest were often those who could build and maintain these crucial warming partnerships. Historians still argue whether medieval jailers actively encouraged these group sleeping arrangements, or simply tolerated them as necessary for keeping prisoners alive. Some records suggest that guards understood the survival benefits and occasionally provided extra straw or fabric to groups that demonstrated effective warming strategies. Other evidence points to guards who deliberately disrupted sleeping arrangements as additional psychological torture. The system wasn't perfect, and it came with its own dangers. Overcrowding in warm sleeping groups could lead to suffocation or overheating. Personal hygiene became a group concern since one person's illness or parasites could quickly spread through intimate sleeping arrangements. And the social dynamics could turn ugly when resources were scarce, or when personality conflicts arose between people who literally depended on each other for survival. Here's where medieval dungeon survival gets genuinely weird. Prisoners discovered that rats, those universally despised dungeon inhabitants, could actually become life-saving sleeping companions. While modern people might find this idea revolting, desperate prisoners learned to see these rodents as tiny furnaces of warm blood that could mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Rats maintain a body temperature of around 99 degrees Fahrenheit, making them significantly warmer than the stone chambers where both prisoners and rodents struggle to survive. A rat pressed against your back stomach or tucked into your clothing provided a concentrated source of heat that lasted for hours. Smart prisoners learned to encourage rats to nest in their bedding by leaving small food scraps or creating cozy spaces that attracted these furry heat sources. The relationship between prisoners and rats developed into something resembling a mutually beneficial arrangement. Prisoners provided shelter protection from larger predators and occasional food scraps, while rats provided warmth and even served as early warning systems for approaching guards or changing weather conditions. Rats are extremely sensitive to temperature changes and would often seek out human warmth before prisoners themselves realized how cold the night was becoming. Some prisoners became remarkably skilled at rat management, learning to create small fabric pouches or pockets in their clothing where rats could nest comfortably. These prisoners understood that a happy, well-fed rat was more likely to stay put through the night, providing consistent warmth rather than wandering off in search of food or better shelter. They learned which rats were more docile and likely to remain still during sleep versus which ones were too restless to serve as effective bed warmers. The practice required overcoming significant psychological barriers, especially for prisoners from wealthy backgrounds who had never shared living space with rodents. But survival has a way of adjusting personal preferences rapidly. Chronicles from medieval prisons occasionally mention prisoners who developed almost affectionate relationships with particular rats, giving them names and treating them as tiny roommates rather than pests. Rats also served practical functions beyond warmth. They were excellent indicators of air quality. If rats started acting agitated or tried to leave the cell, it often meant that dangerous gases were building up, or that ventilation was becoming inadequate. Rats could also detect human illness before symptoms became obvious, often abandoning sick prisoners whose body temperature or scent changed in ways that indicated disease. The cleanliness factor was always a concern since rats carried fleas, lice, and various diseases that could spread to human hosts. However, many prisoners discovered that well-fed, warm rats were actually cleaner than starving ones, spending more time grooming themselves and less time scavenging through filthy areas. Some prisoners even learned basic rat health management, understanding that sick rats were dangerous, both as disease carriers and as poor heat sources. Different types of rats provided different advantages. Larger rats generated more heat but required more space and food. Smaller rats could nestle into tighter spaces but provided less warmth. Young rats were often more active and harder to keep still, while older rats might sleep more soundly but generate less body heat. Experienced prisoners learned to identify which rats would make the best sleeping partners based on size, temperament, and health. The practice created some genuinely touching moments of interspecies cooperation. Guards sometimes reported prisoners who would share their meager food rations with rats, understanding that keeping their tiny heaters well fed was essential for their own survival. Some prisoners developed elaborate sleeping arrangements where multiple rats would nest in different parts of their bedding, creating a distributed heating system that kept them warm throughout the night. Historians still debate how widespread this practice actually was, since many prison records were kept by guards and administrators who might not have understood or wanted to document the details of prisoner survival strategies. However, enough anecdotal evidence exists to suggest that rat partnerships were common enough to be considered a standard survival technique in many medieval dungeons. When your life depends on keeping blood flowing through extremities that want to shut down from cold, you become remarkably inventive about circulation management. Medieval prisoners developed crude but effective techniques for maintaining blood flow and preventing the fatal stillness that could turn fingers, toes, and eventually vital organs into frozen tissue. The most basic technique involved constant subtle movement during sleep. Prisoners learned to flex their toes inside whatever footwear they had, curl and uncurl their fingers and shift positions just enough to keep blood moving without fully waking themselves or disturbing sleeping partners. This required training your body to maintain minimal movement patterns even during deep sleep, a skill that took weeks to develop but could save your life indefinitely. Experienced prisoners taught newcomers the warm-up ritual that had to be performed every time you woke during the night. This involved a specific sequence of movements designed to assess circulation and restore blood flow to areas that might be shutting down. You'd start by wiggling fingers and toes, then progress to rolling ankles and wrists, followed by gentle stretching of arms and legs. The entire process took only a few minutes but could prevent permanent damage from interrupted circulation. Breathing techniques played a crucial role in internal heat generation. Prisoners discovered that certain breathing patterns could increase core body temperature and improve circulation to extremities. Deep controlled breathing exercises helped pump warm blood from the core to fingers and toes, while rapid, shallow breathing could generate internal heat through increased metabolism. Some prisoners developed elaborate breathing routines that they performed several times throughout the night. The strategic use of body positioning became an art form. Prisoners learned that certain positions helped blood flow while others restricted circulation dangerously. Sleeping with arms and legs slightly elevated helped prevent blood from pooling in extremities. Curling into tight fetal positions conserved core heat, but could cut off circulation to limbs. The trick was finding positions that balanced heat conservation with healthy blood flow. Manual massage and pressure techniques were essential for maintaining circulation in sleeping partners. Prisoners would take turns gently massaging each other's hands, feet and limbs to keep blood moving through areas that were most vulnerable to frostbite. These massage techniques were passed down through informal prison education systems, with experienced prisoners teaching newcomers how to detect circulation problems and restore blood flow before permanent damage occurred. Some prisoners developed sophisticated understanding of pressure points and circulation pathways that would impress modern medical professionals. They learned where to apply gentle pressure to stimulate blood flow, how to recognize the early signs of circulation shutdown, and which areas of the body were most critical to keep warm for overall survival. This knowledge often meant the difference between waking up with all your fingers and toes versus facing amputation or death. The timing of circulation maintenance became crucial during long winter nights. Prisoners learned to wake themselves at regular intervals, typically every 2 to 3 hours, to perform circulation checks and warming exercises. Some groups developed systems where different prisoners would take turns staying awake to monitor sleeping partners for signs of circulation problems, gently waking and assisting anyone whose breathing became too shallow or whose extremities felt dangerously cold. Understanding how different foods affected circulation became part of survival strategy. Certain foods, when available, could improve blood flow and internal heat generation. Spicy foods, when prisoners could obtain them, helped stimulate circulation. Foods high in fat provided longer-lasting internal fuel for heat generation. Even hot water, when available, could be used to warm extremities and restore circulation to areas that were shutting down. Prisoners also learned to recognize the warning signs of serious circulation problems in themselves and others. Blue or white fingertips numbness that didn't respond to warming efforts, and skin that felt hard or waxy to the touch, all indicated dangerous circulation loss that required immediate intervention. The most experienced prisoners could often save extremities that less knowledgeable people would have lost to frostbite. Here's where the brutal reality of medieval justice reveals an unexpected human complexity. Even the guards charged with keeping prisoners suffered in the same freezing conditions, and this shared misery sometimes created moments of mercy that could save lives. Guards weren't immune to the bone-deep cold that made dungeon duty one of the most dreaded assignments in medieval service. Picture the guard's dilemma. You're responsible for keeping prisoners alive long enough to serve their sentences or await trial, but you're also working in conditions that threaten your own survival. Guards typically worked shifts of several hours in underground chambers where their breath fogged and their fingers grew too numb to properly grip their keys. Many guards developed the same circulation problems, frostbite risks, and cold-related illnesses as the prisoners they supervised. This shared suffering occasionally translated into small acts of humanity that prisoners learned to recognize and cultivate. A guard whose own feet were going numb might allow prisoners to stamp around their cells for a few extra minutes during inspection rounds. A guard who understood the deadly mathematics of hypothermia might look the other way when prisoners shared bedding or huddled together for warmth, even though regulations often prohibited such arrangements. Some guards developed informal systems for distributing extra resources during particularly brutal cold snaps. They might accidentally leave additional straw near cells, or fail to notice when prisoners acquired extra fabric scraps for insulation. Experienced guards understood that dead prisoners created administrative problems and investigations that nobody wanted to deal with, so keeping inmates barely alive served everyone's interests. The most pragmatic guards learned to read the signs of dangerous cold exposure in both prisoners and themselves. They could recognize when a prisoner was approaching hypothermia and needed intervention to prevent death. Some guards carried small braziers or heated stones that they would place near cell doors during the coldest nights, ostensibly for their own comfort, but positioned to provide some warmth to nearby prisoners. Guard rotations became crucial for prisoner survival. Newer guards often stuck rigidly to regulations, while experienced guards had learned which rules could be bent without consequences. Prisoners quickly learned to identify sympathetic guards and time their requests for help accordingly. A request for extra straw or permission to move around might be granted by one guard and harshly denied by another. The economics of guard duty also influenced prisoner treatment. Guards were typically paid very little, and often came from backgrounds not much better than the prisoners they watched. Many guards understood that they were only a few bad decisions or unfortunate circumstances away from being on the other side of the cell doors. This awareness sometimes translated into empathy that manifested in small kindnesses that could mean survival. Some guards developed personal relationships with long-term prisoners, especially those who demonstrated useful skills or provided information about potential escape attempts or troublemakers. These relationships might result in preferential treatment, an extra blanket during winter, better quality food scraps, or warnings about particularly harsh treatment planned by other guards or administrators. The guard's own survival needs sometimes aligned with prisoner welfare in unexpected ways. Guards needed fires to stay warm during their shifts, and these fires provided ambient heat that benefited nearby prisoners. Guards who brought food or drink to sustain themselves during long shifts might share small portions with prisoners, partly from humanity and partly to maintain goodwill that made their jobs easier. Historians still debate how common these merciful interactions actually were, versus how often guards maintained strict harsh discipline regardless of conditions. Medieval records tend to focus on official policies rather than day-to-day human interactions, making it difficult to assess how frequently guard sympathy translated into prisoner survival assistance. However, enough anecdotal evidence exists to suggest that the shared experience of suffering in freezing dungeons created a complex dynamic where survival sometimes transcended the strict boundaries between captor and captive. Guards who showed mercy weren't necessarily being soft, they were often being practical, understanding that some flexibility in harsh conditions served everyone's interests better than rigid adherence to rules that might result in unnecessary deaths. Underground chambers present a unique survival challenge that goes beyond simple cold. They create environments where moisture becomes your enemy in ways that surface dwellers never experience. Medieval dungeons carved into earth or built below ground level existed in a constant state of dampness that turned already dangerous cold into something far more insidious and life-threatening. The science behind dungeon dampness involves groundwater condensation and thermal dynamics that medieval builders didn't fully understand, but prisoners experienced with brutal clarity. Underground chambers naturally collect moisture from surrounding soil, creating humidity levels that rarely drop below uncomfortable and often reach dangerous saturation points. This moisture doesn't just make things unpleasant, it fundamentally changes how cold affects the human body. Wet cold penetrates clothing, bedding, and skin far more effectively than dry cold. When your straw bedding absorbs moisture from the air and ground, it loses most of its insulating properties and actually begins conducting heat away from your body. Damp fabric clings to skin, creating direct thermal bridges that drain body heat with frightening efficiency. Prisoners quickly learned that staying dry wasn't just about comfort, it was about preventing their own clothing and bedding from becoming instruments of hypothermia. The walls themselves became active participants in this moisture warfare. Stone walls underground act like massive sponges absorbing groundwater and slowly releasing it into the air as humidity and condensation. During winter months, the temperature differential between the relatively warm air from prisoners' breath and body heat and the cold stone walls created constant condensation that dripped from ceilings and ran down walls like indoor rain. Prisoners developed sophisticated strategies for managing moisture that would impress modern survivalists. They learned to create drainage systems using small stones and debris to channel water away from sleeping areas. They discovered that certain areas of cells stayed drier than others, usually spots furthest from walls that contacted soil directly or areas where air circulation was slightly better. The battle against dampness required constant vigilance and maintenance. Prisoners learned to wring out fabric regularly even if it meant handling freezing wet cloth with numb fingers. They discovered that body heat could be used strategically to dry small items, tuck in damp socks or fabric scraps against warm skin to remove moisture while simultaneously warming the fabric for better insulation. Understanding seasonal moisture patterns became crucial for long-term survival. Spring thaws brought flooding and increased groundwater that could turn dungeon floors into shallow pools. Winter freezes sometimes reduced humidity temporarily, but created new problems when any available water turned to ice. Summer heat could create oppressive humidity that made breathing difficult in poorly ventilated cells. Some prisoners became expert at reading moisture signs that predicted weather changes. They learned that certain patterns of condensation on walls indicated incoming storms or temperature shifts. They could predict particularly damp nights based on air pressure changes that they felt in their bodies, but couldn't consciously identify. This weather sensitivity helped them prepare by adjusting bedding arrangements or seeking better shelter within their cells. The most successful prisoners learned to work with moisture rather than simply fighting it. They discovered that some dampness could be beneficial. Wet cloth wrapped around extremities could prevent frostbite when managed correctly, and humid air was sometimes easier to breathe than extremely dry air during harsh winter cold. The trick was managing moisture levels to avoid the dangerous extremes while taking advantage of any benefits. Springs and underground water sources created particular challenges in some dungeons. Natural springs might provide fresh water for drinking, but also created permanently wet areas that were impossible to make habitable. Some dungeons were built over underground streams that created constant flowing water through parts of the facility convenient for waste disposal, but terrible for anyone trying to sleep nearby. Prisoners often had to choose between the relative dryness of areas further from water sources and the practical benefits of being near places where they could access drinking water or wash themselves and their belongings. These location decisions within cells became strategic choices that could significantly impact survival chances during particularly harsh weather. When you're stripped of almost everything and thrown into a stone icebox, every thread of fabric on your body transforms from simple clothing into a sophisticated life support system. Medieval prisoners learned to treat their garments not as fashion statements, but as layered armor against an environment actively trying to kill them through heat loss. The typical prisoner arrived with whatever clothes they wore during arrest, perhaps a wool tunic linen, undergarments, woolen hose, and leather shoes if they were fortunate. These weren't specialized survival gear, but prisoners quickly learned to optimize every fiber for maximum thermal protection. The key was understanding that air trapped between layers provided insulation, while fabric pressed directly against skin could either conserve or drain body heat depending on how it was managed. Layering became an art form that required constant adjustment based on activity level, time of day, and weather conditions. Prisoners learned to wear their heaviest wool garments as outer layers to block wind and provide structural warmth, while keeping lighter linen pieces against their skin to wick moisture away from their bodies. This prevented the dangerous situation where sweat or condensation could freeze against skin, creating ice patches that dramatically increased heat loss. The strategic use of openings and closures transformed basic medieval clothing into adjustable thermal systems. Prisoners learned to loosen garments during periods of activity to prevent overheating and sweating, then quickly tighten everything back up when settling down for sleep. They discovered that tucking fabric edges into other layers created sealed systems that trapped warm air more effectively than loose-flowing garments. Fabric modification became essential survival crafting. Prisoners learned to tear strips from less critical clothing items to create additional insulation layers or to seal gaps where heat escaped. They discovered that stuffing fabric scraps between layers could create improvised insulation similar to modern down jackets. Some prisoners became skilled at unraveling thread from damaged clothing to create ties and fasteners that help secure layered garments more effectively. Footwear required particular attention, since feet were often the first extremities to suffer serious cold damage. Prisoners learned to stuff dry straw fabric scraps or even hair into their shoes to create additional insulation. They discovered that wrapping feet in multiple layers of cloth before putting on shoes could prevent dangerous heat loss, while also protecting against the sharp stones and rough surfaces of dungeon floors. Head and neck coverage became crucial for overall body temperature regulation. Medieval understanding of anatomy wasn't sophisticated, but prisoners quickly learned through experience that keeping heads warm had disproportionate effects on overall body temperature. They fashioned improvised hats from fabric scraps, learned to pull clothing up over their heads during sleep, and discovered that wrapping necks could significantly improve circulation and warmth retention. The management of fabric moisture required constant attention and strategic thinking. Prisoners learned to rotate garments when possible, wearing drier layers against skin while allowing damp outer layers to dry using body heat. They discovered that certain fabrics dried faster than others. Wool retained warmth even when damp, while linen dried quickly, but provided little insulation when wet. Fabric repair became a survival skill rather than simply maintenance. Prisoners learned to patch holes and tears not just for modesty, but because openings in clothing created thermal leaks that could be deadly during cold nights. They became skilled at using thorns, small bones, or improvised needles to make repairs using thread pulled from other garments or twisted from fabric scraps. The sharing and trading of clothing items created informal economies within prison populations. A prisoner with an extra cloak might trade warmth access for food portions or protection services. Groups of prisoners sometimes pooled clothing resources, creating communal wardrobes that could be redistributed based on changing needs or health conditions. Some prisoners developed techniques for using clothing as multi-purpose survival tools beyond just warmth. Fabric could be used to create primitive water filters, improvised rope for securing bedding, or even as padding to make stone surfaces more tolerable. The most resourceful prisoners learned to see every piece of fabric as potential material for solving multiple survival challenges. Understanding fabric behavior in different conditions became crucial knowledge. Prisoners learned which materials held warmth better when wet, which fabrics were most effective at blocking wind, and how different weaves and textures could be combined for maximum thermal efficiency. The mathematics of survival in a freezing dungeon demanded that someone stay awake while others slept, creating informal watch systems that turned sleeping into a coordinated group effort, where vigilance meant the difference between morning and death. Medieval prisoners discovered that hypothermia's most dangerous trick was making victims feel sleepy and comfortable just before it killed them, requiring constant monitoring to prevent the fatal sleep from which no one awakens. The night watch rotation developed into sophisticated systems that balanced the need for rest with the necessity of survival surveillance. Typically, groups of prisoners would organize themselves so that one person remained awake during each 2-hour period throughout the night, responsible for monitoring the breathing circulation and responsiveness of sleeping cellmates. This wasn't casual observation. It required focused attention to detect the subtle signs that someone was sliding toward hypothermia. Experienced prisoners learned to recognize the warning signs that demanded immediate intervention. Shallow, irregular breathing indicated that someone's metabolism was slowing dangerously. Skin that felt cold and clammy to the touch suggested circulation problems that could lead to frostbite or worse. Most critically, prisoners who became difficult to wake or seemed confused when roused were showing signs of severe hypothermia that required aggressive warming efforts to prevent death. The wake-up protocols became ritualized procedures that prisoners practiced until they could perform them effectively, even when exhausted and cold themselves. The process started with gentle shaking and vocal attempts to rouse a sleeping prisoner. If that failed, the watcher would apply pressure to pressure points rub extremities vigorously, and if necessary use body heat transfer by pressing warm skin against the cold person's neck, wrists, or other pulse points. These watch systems required enormous trust and cooperation among prisoners who might otherwise be rivals or enemies. Taking a watch shift meant sacrificing your own desperately needed sleep to protect others with the understanding that they would do the same for you. Breaking watch duties or falling asleep during your shift was considered one of the most serious betrayals possible in prison culture, since it literally put lives at risk. Different prisoners brought different skills to watch duty. Some became expert at reading breathing patterns and could detect problems from across a cell. Others developed sensitive touch that could assess circulation and temperature through quick examinations. A few prisoners seemed to have natural internal clocks that helped them maintain accurate timing for watch rotations, even without any external time references. The psychological challenge of staying awake during watch shifts was enormous. Prisoners were already exhausted from poor nutrition, physical stress, and previous sleep deprivation. Staying alert in cold, dark conditions when your body desperately wanted to rest required mental discipline that many prisoners had to develop from scratch. Some used meditation techniques. Others relied on physical exercises or mental games to maintain alertness. Communication between watchers became crucial for maintaining effective surveillance. Prisoners developed quiet signals and whispered communication methods that allowed them to coordinate care without waking sleeping cellmates unnecessarily. They learned to work together when someone showed serious signs of hypothermia, with one person providing direct warming while another gathered additional bedding or clothing. The watch system also served secondary survival functions beyond preventing hypothermia deaths. Alert prisoners could respond quickly to other medical emergencies, detect approaching guards or changing conditions, and coordinate group responses to threats or opportunities. The constant vigilance created a security network that helped protect vulnerable sleeping prisoners from various dangers. Some prisons developed informal training systems where experienced prisoners taught newcomers how to perform effective watch duties. This knowledge transfer included how to assess someone's condition quickly and quietly, which warming techniques worked best in different situations, and how to maintain alertness during long cold watches when falling asleep could be deadly for everyone. The emotional burden of a watch duty was significant. Watchers sometimes had to make difficult decisions about when someone was beyond help, when to wake the entire group for a medical emergency, or how to allocate limited warming resources among multiple people showing signs of cold exposure. These responsibilities created psychological stress that added to the already overwhelming challenges of dungeon survival. When your body is burning through calories just to maintain basic life functions in freezing conditions, every morsel of food becomes precious fuel that could determine whether you generate enough internal heat to survive another night. Medieval prisoners learned to think about nutrition not in terms of satisfaction or taste, but as strategic fuel management where the wrong food choices could literally mean freezing to death. The typical prison diet was designed to keep inmates alive at minimum cost, consisting primarily of coarse bread, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of meat or vegetables. But in freezing conditions, these meagre rations took on life or death significance. Prisoners quickly discovered that different foods provided different types of internal heating. Some burned hot and fast like kindling, while others provided slow, steady warmth like hardwood logs in a fireplace. Bread, the staple of prison diets, provided carbohydrates that could be converted relatively quickly into heat energy. Smart prisoners learned to eat bread in small portions throughout the day, rather than consuming their entire ration at once, maintaining steady fuel for their internal heating systems. They discovered that day-old bread retained more nutrients than fresher bread that had been stored in damp conditions, and that harder crusts actually provided more sustained energy than soft centers. Fat became the most valuable nutritional resource for cold survival. Any meat scraps that contained fat were treasured far beyond their apparent food value because fat provides more than twice the calories per gram of carbohydrates or protein. Prisoners learned to save every trace of fat from their rations, sometimes storing it in small containers made from fabric or carved wood to be consumed during the coldest parts of the night, when their bodies needed maximum fuel for heat generation. The timing of food consumption became a survival strategy that prisoners refined through trial and error. Eating the largest meal possible before sleep provided fuel for overnight heat generation, but consuming too much could divert blood flow to digestion when it was needed for circulation to extremities. Prisoners learned to balance these competing needs, often eating smaller portions throughout the evening, to maintain steady internal heating without compromising circulation. Some prisoners developed techniques for maximizing nutrition from minimal food supplies. They learned to chew thoroughly to aid digestion and absorption, discovered that warming food slightly before eating helped their bodies process it more efficiently, and found that certain combinations of available foods provided better sustained energy than eating items separately. The psychological aspects of food as fuel were almost as important as the nutritional benefits. Having a small food reserve, even just a crust of bread hidden away, provided mental comfort that helped prisoners maintain the will to survive through particularly brutal nights. This psychological boost had real physiological effects, helping maintain the mental alertness and decision-making capabilities necessary for implementing other survival strategies. Prisoners who received occasional food packages from family or friends learned to manage these windfalls strategically, rather than consuming everything immediately. They would carefully ration special items like dried fruits, nuts, or preserved meats to provide crucial nutrition supplements during the coldest weather when their bodies needed maximum fuel. Some prisoners became skilled at preserving and storing these special foods to prevent spoilage in damp dungeon conditions. Water consumption required careful balance in cold conditions. Staying hydrated was essential for maintaining circulation and overall body function, but consuming too much cold water could lower core body temperature dangerously. Prisoners learned to warm water slightly when possible by holding containers against their bodies and to drink in small sips rather than large quantities that could shock their systems. The sharing of food took on survival significance beyond simple generosity. Prisoners learned that keeping cellmates adequately fed served everyone's interests, since malnourished prisoners couldn't contribute effectively to group warming efforts and were more likely to succumb to hypothermia. Some groups developed food-sharing systems that ensured everyone received adequate nutrition for survival, even when individual rations varied. Understanding how different medical conditions affected nutritional needs became crucial survival knowledge. Sick prisoners needed more calories to fight illness while also maintaining body heat. Injured prisoners required additional protein for healing. Prisoners showing signs of scurvy or other nutritional deficiencies needed specific foods when available. The most experienced prisoners learned to recognize these conditions and advocate for appropriate food allocation within their groups. When your body is pushed beyond its physical limits in an environment designed to break you, the mind becomes your most powerful survival tool, and medieval prisoners discovered that prayer, meditation, and mental discipline could generate warmth, conserve energy, and maintain the will to live through nights that seemed impossible to survive. The intersection of faith and survival created powerful psychological tools that prisoners used to manage both the physical and mental challenges of freezing dungeons. Prayer served multiple survival functions. It provided mental focus that helped distract from immediate discomfort, created calming rhythms that helped regulate breathing and heart rate, and offered psychological comfort that reduced stress-related energy expenditure that prisoners couldn't afford to waste. Experienced prisoners developed meditation techniques that helped them mentally separate from physical suffering while maintaining awareness of their body's needs. They learned to enter focused mental states that allowed them to monitor circulation, breathing, and temperature, while psychologically distancing themselves from the immediate sensation of cold. This wasn't mystical nonsense, it was practical mental training that helped them endure conditions that might otherwise drive them to panic or despair. The recitation of prayers, psalms, or memorized texts served as mental exercises that kept minds active and engaged during long dark hours when there was nothing else to do but suffer. Prisoners discovered that rhythmic recitation helped regulate breathing patterns, which in turn helped maintain circulation and body heat. The familiar words provided mental anchors that prevented their thoughts from spiraling into despair or fear that could be psychologically devastating. Group prayer and shared religious observances created social bonding that had real survival benefits. When prisoners prayed together, they created shared rhythms of breathing and movement that helped coordinate group warming efforts. The social connection provided emotional support that helped maintain morale and the will to survive, while the group activity generated small amounts of additional body heat through synchronized movement and vocalization. Mental exercises beyond formal prayer became crucial tools for psychological survival. Prisoners learned to occupy their minds with memory exercises, mental calculations, storytelling, or detailed mental reconstruction of better times and places. These activities served dual purposes. They provided distraction from immediate suffering, while keeping minds sharp and functional despite the physical stress of cold and malnutrition. The management of fear and despair required sophisticated psychological techniques that prisoners often had to develop through trial and error. Unchecked fear increased heart rate, and breathing wasting precious energy and potentially disrupting the careful circulation management that kept extremities from freezing. Prisoners learned to use prayer and meditation to maintain emotional equilibrium that conserved energy while keeping their minds clear for survival decision-making. Some prisoners developed sophisticated mental mapping techniques that helped them optimize their physical environment for survival. They would spend time in focused meditation mentally cataloging every detail of their cell's microclimate, where drafts were strongest, which areas stayed slightly warmer, how air currents moved through the space. This mental mapping allowed them to make strategic decisions about positioning and movement based on detailed environmental knowledge. The relationship between mental state and physical pain management became crucial survival knowledge. Prisoners discovered that certain mental techniques could help them tolerate the discomfort of cold without tensing muscles that needed to stay relaxed for proper circulation. They learned to accept pain without fighting it, understanding that mental resistance to suffering often made physical conditions worse. Religious faith provided hope that helped prisoners maintain long-term survival motivation. Believing that their suffering had meaning that they might be released, or that their current situation was temporary, helped them maintain the psychological energy necessary for implementing daily survival strategies. Without hope, many prisoners simply gave up the exhausting effort required to stay alive in impossible conditions. The sharing of prayer stories and mental exercises created informal education systems where experienced prisoners taught newcomers psychological survival techniques. This knowledge transfer often made the difference between prisoners who adapted successfully to dungeon conditions and those who succumbed to despair and stopped taking care of themselves effectively. Understanding the relationship between mental state and physical health became essential knowledge. Prisoners learned that depression and hopelessness had real physiological effects that reduced their body's ability to generate heat and fight off illness. Maintaining psychological health wasn't luxury. It was a survival necessity that required as much attention as physical warmth and nutrition. The air you breathe in a freezing stone chamber isn't just about oxygen. It becomes a shared resource that prisoners learn to warm, humidify, and manage collectively to create tiny zones of survivable atmosphere in an environment that seemed determined to freeze their lungs from the inside out. Medieval prisoners discovered that coordinated breathing techniques could transform the deadly air of dungeons into something approaching livable conditions. The science behind shared breath warming involves the fact that exhaled air is significantly warmer and more humid than the frigid air in medieval dungeons. Each breath you exhale carries body heat and moisture that can raise the temperature and humidity of a small airspace by several degrees when managed strategically. Prisoners learned to position themselves to take advantage of this biological heating system, creating warm microclimates that could mean the difference between comfortable sleep and hypothermic death. Group breathing techniques developed into sophisticated coordinated efforts where prisoners would synchronize their respiratory patterns to maximize the warming effect of their collective exhalation. By breathing in unison while positioned close together, they could create small pockets of warm, humid air that circulated between their bodies and provided significantly more comfortable breathing conditions than the harsh, dry air of the dungeon. The positioning strategies for optimal breath sharing required careful planning and cooperation. Prisoners learned to arrange themselves so that one person's exhalation would be positioned to warm another person's inhalation zone. This often meant sleeping with faces relatively close together, which required trust and coordination, but could create warm air pockets that made breathing easier and less energy-intensive throughout the night. Understanding air circulation pattern within cells became crucial knowledge for effective breath management. Prisoners learned to identify areas where warm air naturally collected or moved, positioning themselves to take advantage of these thermal currents, while avoiding zones where cold air pooled or where drafts would immediately dissipate their warming efforts. They became expert at reading how air moved through their specific cell environments. The timing of coordinated breathing efforts required group discipline and communication. Prisoners developed quiet signals for coordinating breathing patterns without disturbing those who were sleeping. They learned to maintain synchronized breathing for periods long enough to create noticeable warming effects while avoiding hyperventilation or other breathing problems that could arise from forced respiratory patterns. Some prisoners became skilled at using clothing and bedding materials to create crude air management systems that trapped and circulated warm exhaled air more effectively. They would arrange fabric to create small tents or enclosed spaces where warm breath could accumulate and provide sustained heating effects. These improvised air management systems were particularly effective during the coldest parts of the night, when every degree of temperature difference mattered. The technique required understanding the balance between maximizing warm air sharing and maintaining adequate fresh air circulation. Too much focus on trapping warm breath could lead to dangerous carbon dioxide buildup or oxygen depletion, while too much fresh air circulation would immediately dissipate any warming benefits. Experienced prisoners learned to find the optimal balance that provided warmth without creating breathing hazards. Group breathing coordination also served social and psychological functions beyond simple thermal management. The synchronized breathing created a sense of unity and cooperation that helped maintain group morale and social bonds. The rhythmic meditative quality of coordinated breathing helped reduce stress and anxiety, while providing a shared activity that gave prisoners some sense of control over their environment. Different breathing techniques provided various benefits depending on conditions and needs. Slow, deep breathing helped maximize the warming effect of each exhalation while conserving energy. Faster, shallower breathing could generate internal heat through increased metabolism when prisoners needed to warm up quickly. Prisoners learned to switch between different breathing patterns based on their immediate survival needs. The sharing of breath-warming knowledge became part of the informal education system that helped new prisoners adapt to dungeon survival. Experienced prisoners would teach newcomers how to position themselves for optimal air sharing, how to coordinate breathing with cellmates, and how to recognize when air quality was becoming dangerous and required intervention. Understanding individual breathing patterns and health conditions became important for effective group breath management. Prisoners with respiratory illnesses might need different positioning or breathing support. Those who snored or had irregular breathing patterns required special accommodation to maintain effective air sharing without disrupting others' sleep. The calendar becomes your enemy when you're trapped in a stone icebox because medieval winters weren't just cold, they were strategically different types of cold that required completely different survival approaches as the season progressed, from the manageable chill of autumn through the bone-deep death grip of deep winter that could kill you in entirely new ways. Early autumn, cold typically, September through November, presented what prisoners learned to call deceptive cold temperatures that felt manageable during the day but dropped dangerously at night. During this period, the stone walls hadn't yet absorbed the full brutal cold of winter, so they still retained some residual warmth from summer. Prisoners could often survive autumn nights with basic survival techniques, decent straw bedding, shared body heat, and careful layering of available clothing. But experienced prisoners warned newcomers never to become complacent during autumn cold, because it was merely training for the real battle ahead. They used these relatively manageable months to perfect their survival techniques, test different sleeping arrangements, identify the warmest spots in their cells, and build the social cooperation systems that would become life or death necessities when true winter arrived. December through February brought what prisoners called stone cold, the period when the massive thermal mass of dungeon walls became actively hostile. radiating accumulated cold with relentless efficiency. During deep winter, even the most sophisticated survival techniques might barely keep prisoners alive through nights when temperatures could drop well below freezing inside supposedly enclosed chambers. Stone cold required completely different survival strategies than autumn chill. Simple shared body heat wasn't enough when the walls themselves were pulling warmth from the air faster than human bodies could generate it. Prisoners needed maximum efficiency in every aspect of their survival system's perfectly organized bedding that trapped every possible bit of warm air, coordinated group breathing techniques, strategic rationing of food for internal heat generation, and round-the-clock vigilance to prevent hypothermia deaths. The transition periods between seasonal cold types often caught prisoners off guard and proved particularly dangerous. Late November and early December, when autumn cold was shifting, to stone cold required constant adjustment of survival techniques. Strategies that worked effectively in October could become inadequate or even dangerous by January, when the increased severity of conditions demanded more sophisticated approaches. Spring cold from March through May presented unique challenges that inexperienced prisoners often underestimated. While temperatures were rising overall, spring brought dramatic fluctuations that could shift from relatively comfortable days to brutally cold nights with little warning. The psychological challenge of spring cold was particularly difficult. Prisoners who had survived deep winter sometimes relaxed their vigilance just when changing conditions required continued careful attention. Damp spring cold often felt more penetrating than dry winter cold because increased humidity and groundwater made dungeon conditions particularly miserable. Prisoners who had successfully managed dry winter conditions sometimes struggled with the wet cold of spring thaws that soaked bedding clothing, and even the air itself with moisture that dramatically increased heat loss. Weather pattern recognition became crucial survival knowledge that prisoners developed through careful observation and hard-learned experience. They learned to read subtle signs that predicted particularly dangerous cold snaps, changes in air pressure that they felt in their joint shifts in humidity that affected how voices echoed in stone chambers, or changes in guard behavior that indicated severe weather approaching. Different geographic regions created seasonal variations that required locally adapted survival strategies. Northern dungeons might experience cold that lasted from October through April, requiring 6 months of maximum survival effort. Southern regions might have shorter but more intense cold periods or wet cold that presented different challenges than dry cold. Prisoners who had experience in multiple locations became valuable teachers who could share region-specific survival knowledge. The psychological management of seasonal cold required understanding that different types of cold affected mental state differently. The gradual onset of autumn cold allowed mental adaptation, while the sudden severity of deep winter could create shock and despair that undermined survival efforts. Spring cold often brought false hope that made setbacks particularly devastating to prisoner morale. Food and resource management had to be adjusted based on seasonal cold requirements. Autumn cold might be survivable with normal prison rations, while deep winter required every possible calorie for internal heat generation. Prisoners learned to conserve and save resources during milder periods to prepare for the increased demands of the coldest months. Some nights, despite every survival technique and all the ingenuity that desperation could inspire, prisoners simply didn't make it to morning, and the presence of their bodies created grim warnings that taught harsh lessons about the absolute limits of human endurance in conditions designed to kill slowly and efficiently. The progression of hypothermia, death in medieval dungeons, followed a predictable pattern. that experienced prisoners learned to recognize and fear. It typically began with violent shivering, as the body attempted to generate heat through muscle contractions, followed by a period of apparent calm as the shivering stopped, not because the person was warming up, but because their body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core temperature for vital organs. The most terrifying aspect of hypothermia death was how peaceful it could appear to observers. Prisoners who were dying from cold often became drowsy and confused, sometimes even feeling warm and comfortable in their final hours, as their body's temperature regulation systems failed catastrophically. They might remove clothing or bedding feeling overheated even as their core temperature dropped to fatal levels. Cellmates learned to recognize this paradoxical undressing as a sign of imminent death that required immediate intervention. Death nights typically occurred during the coldest periods, when multiple factors combined to overwhelm even well-prepared prisoners. A sudden drop in temperature combined with illness, inadequate food, or disrupted group sleeping arrangements could push someone past the point where their body could maintain essential functions. Guards often found prisoners who had simply stopped breathing during the night, their bodies curled in sleeping positions that looked almost comfortable. The social dynamics around death nights created complex emotional challenges for surviving prisoners. Those who died often did so quietly without obvious struggle, making their deaths particularly traumatic for cellmates who'd been sleeping nearby. Survivors frequently blamed themselves for not recognizing warning signs earlier or for failing to provide adequate warming assistance. The presence of bodies in cells created immediate practical problems beyond the emotional trauma. Dead bodies lost heat rapidly and actually began drawing warmth away from living prisoners if left in shared sleeping areas. Guards often didn't remove bodies immediately, especially during severe weather when moving through the prison was dangerous or difficult, leaving survivors to manage both the psychological horror and the practical cooling effect of corpses. Some prisoners developed protocols for managing cellmate deaths that helped both honor the deceased and protect the living. They learned to move bodies away from sleeping areas to prevent heat loss, to arrange the deceased in dignified positions, and to conduct simple religious observances that provided psychological closure while maintaining group morale and survival motivation. The frequency of death nights varied dramatically based on conditions, but experienced prisoners could often predict when mortality rates would increase. Extended periods of severe cold food, shortages, overcrowding that prevented effective group warming, or outbreaks of illness that weakened prisoners' resistance, all created conditions where death became statistically likely rather than just possible. Guards' responses to prisoner deaths reveal the complex economics and logistics of medieval imprisonment. Some guards showed genuine concern for preventing deaths, understanding that prisoner mortality reflected poorly on their competence and created administrative complications. Others seemed indifferent, viewing prisoner deaths as natural consequences of imprisonment that reduced overcrowding and feeding costs. The fear of death nights motivated many of the most sophisticated survival strategies that prisoners developed. The knowledge that any given night might be their last encouraged maximum cooperation in group warming efforts, careful resource conservation, and vigilant monitoring of cellmates' health and temperature. This fear was psychologically exhausting, but also served as motivation for maintaining survival discipline. Seasonal patterns of prisoner mortality provided grim data that informed survival strategies. Deaths typically peaked during the coldest months, particularly in January and February, when accumulated cold stress combined with winter food shortages and increased illness rates. Prisoners who survived these peak mortality periods often developed confidence and skills that helped them endure subsequent winters. The randomness of who died and who survived created ongoing psychological stress for prisoners who struggled to understand why they remained alive while others perished. Some prisoners developed survivor guilt that undermined their own survival efforts, while others became obsessively focused on survival techniques that might help them avoid their cellmates' fate. Learning from death knights became part of the informal education system that helped prisoners improve their survival techniques. Each death provided lessons about what strategies had failed, which warning signs had been missed, and how group dynamics might be adjusted to better protect vulnerable members. Money, rank, and noble blood couldn't change the fundamental physics of freezing stone chambers, but wealthy prisoners discovered that even in the most egalitarian environment of shared suffering privilege, could still purchase small advantages that might mean the difference between survival and becoming another winter casualty statistics. Noble prisoners arrived in dungeons with certain advantages that affected their survival prospects from the beginning. They often wore higher quality clothing made from better materials, wool, that retained warmth, even when damp linen that wicked moisture effectively, and sometimes fur-lined garments that provided superior insulation. While guards might confiscate obvious valuables, they often overlooked the survival value of well-made clothing that could be the foundation of effective layering systems. The ransom factor created complex dynamics that influenced how noble prisoners were treated during their captivity. Guards and administrators understood that dead noble prisoners couldn't pay ransoms, creating economic incentives to keep wealthy captives alive that didn't exist for common criminals or political prisoners. This might translate into slightly better food, additional straw for bedding, or access to braziers during the coldest weather. Some noble prisoners maintained networks of supporters who could provide supplies and assistance that dramatically improved survival prospects. Family members, political allies, or religious connections might arrange for regular deliveries of food, clothing, blankets, or even fuel for heating. These external support systems could transform otherwise fatal dungeon conditions into merely miserable but survivable situations. The social skills that many nobles possessed often served them well in prison environments where cooperation was essential for survival. Nobles accustomed to managing servants, negotiating political alliances, and organizing complex households sometimes became natural leaders in coordinating group survival efforts. Their experience with logistics and resource management could be valuable assets in organizing effective sleeping arrangements, food sharing, and watch rotations. However, noble status also created unique vulnerabilities that could undermine survival efforts. Nobles who had never experienced physical hardship might lack the mental resilience needed to endure dungeon conditions. Their unfamiliarity with manual labor, poor nutrition, and basic survival techniques could make them more vulnerable to hypothermia, illness, and psychological breakdown than prisoners from tougher backgrounds. The psychological adjustment required for noble prisoners was often particularly difficult. Nobles accustomed to comfort, privacy, and deference might struggle more severely with the social dynamics of shared survival that required intimate cooperation with common criminals and social inferiors. This psychological stress could undermine their physical health and survival capabilities. Some noble prisoners developed interesting strategies for leveraging their education and cultural knowledge to improve group survival conditions. Nobles who could read and write might serve as record keepers or communicators with guards and administrators. Those with medical knowledge, legal expertise, or other specialized skills could trade knowledge for better treatment or resources. The treatment of noble prisoners varied significantly based on political circumstances surrounding their imprisonment. Nobles imprisoned for political reasons during civil wars might receive harsh treatment designed to break their political influence, while nobles imprisoned for personal crimes might be treated more leniently in hopes of maintaining ransom negotiations. Religious noble prisoners, particularly those with connections to powerful church hierarchies, sometimes received special consideration that improved their survival prospects. Monasteries or religious orders might arrange for support systems that provided food, clothing, and spiritual comfort that helped noble clerics endure dungeon conditions more effectively than secular prisoners. The presence of noble prisoners in dungeons sometimes created interesting social dynamics that affected survival strategies for all inmates. Some noble prisoners shared their advantages with cellmates, understanding that group survival benefited everyone, including themselves. Others hoarded resources or attempted to maintain social hierarchies that could undermine cooperative survival efforts. Female noble prisoners faced additional challenges and advantages that shaped their survival prospects differently than male nobles. They might receive slightly better treatment based on medieval concepts of chivalry and protection of women, but they also faced unique vulnerabilities related to security, healthcare, and social isolation that could make survival more difficult. The long-term survival rates of noble prisoners compared to common prisoners provide interesting historical data about the relationship between wealth privilege and basic human endurance. While money could purchase some advantages, the fundamental challenges of surviving freezing conditions still required personal resilience, social cooperation, and basic survival skills that couldn't simply be bought. Understanding how privilege operated within the constraints of dungeon survival reveals both the limits and the persistence of social hierarchies, even in environments where basic human needs dominated all other considerations. The map of medieval Europe reveals a brutal truth about dungeon survival. Your chances of living through winter imprisonment depended heavily on whether you were locked up in the relatively mild stone chambers of southern France or the deadly ice tombs of northern Scotland, where the same survival techniques could mean the difference between discomfort and death. Northern European dungeons, particularly those in Scotland, northern England, Scandinavia, and the Germanic regions, created survival challenges that pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. In these regions, outdoor winter temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing for months at a time, and underground stone chambers could reach temperatures that would kill unprepared prisoners within hours rather than days. The extreme cold of northern dungeons required survival techniques that bordered on the impossible to sustain long-term. Prisoners needed maximum efficiency in every aspect of their survival systems, perfect coordination of group warming, near constant vigilance against hypothermia, and access to every possible calorie for internal heat generation. Even minor mistakes in clothing management, food rationing, or sleeping arrangements could be fatal in conditions where the margin for error approached zero. Scottish Highland dungeons were particularly notorious for their brutal conditions. Built into castle foundations that were carved directly from mountain stone, these chambers experienced temperature swings that could freeze water solid inside supposedly enclosed spaces. Prisoners in Highland dungeons often had to choose between suffocation in completely sealed sleeping arrangements or hypothermia in spaces with adequate ventilation. The coastal regions of northern Europe presented unique challenges related to humidity and wind exposure that affected dungeon conditions in ways that prisoners had to understand for survival. Coastal dungeons experienced constant dampness from sea air that penetrated stone walls and created the wet cold that was far more dangerous than dry cold. The salt air could also corrode metal fixtures and create air quality problems that affected breathing and health. Southern European dungeons, while still dangerous, offered survival prospects that were significantly better than their northern counterparts. In regions like southern France, northern Italy, and Mediterranean Spain, winter temperatures were less severe and the growing seasons longer meaning that food supplies were generally more adequate, and prisoners arrived in better nutritional condition. The Mediterranean climate created different survival challenges that required adapted techniques. Southern dungeons might experience flash flooding during winter storms, requiring prisoners to manage water intrusion rather than just cold. The milder temperatures also meant that survival techniques developed for extreme cold might be excessive and could lead to overheating or other problems in more moderate conditions. Mountain dungeons presented altitude-related challenges that affected survival regardless of latitude. High-altitude imprisonment meant thinner air that made breathing more difficult, increased solar radiation during the day, followed by dramatic temperature drops at night, and weather patterns that could change rapidly from survivable to deadly, with little warning. River valley dungeons often provided slightly more moderate conditions due to the thermal mass of nearby water bodies, but they also created humidity problems and flood risks that required different survival strategies. Prisoners in valley dungeons might have access to better water supplies, but faced increased risks of disease from dampness and poor drainage. The building materials available in different regions significantly affected dungeon survival conditions. Northern regions, where hard granite and dense stone were common, created chambers that held cold more effectively and provided better structural integrity but worse thermal conditions. Southern regions, where softer limestone and sandstone were used, might offer slightly better insulation properties but could create different problems related to structural integrity and air quality. Seasonal timing of imprisonment created different survival challenges based on geographic location. A prisoner arriving in a Scottish dungeon in October faced 6 months of potentially fatal conditions, while someone imprisoned in a southern French dungeon might only endure 2 or 3 months of genuinely dangerous cold. The availability of fuel and heating materials varied dramatically by region and affected what survival techniques were possible. Northern regions with abundant forests might occasionally provide access to wood for heating, while southern regions might rely more on charcoal or other fuel sources that created different heating patterns and air quality concerns. Understanding regional variations in guard practices, food supplies, and administrative policies helped experienced prisoners adapt their survival strategies to local conditions. Guards in northern regions might be more sympathetic to prisoner survival needs because they understood the deadly nature of the conditions, while southern guards might be less aware of how even moderate cold could be dangerous under dungeon conditions. Regional differences in architectural styles affected survival in subtle but important ways. Northern castles built for siege warfare created different dungeon layouts than southern fortifications designed more for administrative control, and these architectural differences had real impact on air circulation, temperature control, and survival prospects. When frostbite sets in and hypothermia begins its deadly work, modern emergency medicine might save you. But medieval prisoners had to rely on folk remedies, improvised treatments, and hard-earned wisdom passed down through generations of survivors who had learned to heal themselves or die trying in conditions where professional medical help was either non-existent or worse than useless. The understanding of cold-related injuries in medieval times was limited, but surprisingly practical in many ways. Prisoners and their informal healers recognized that frostbite progressed through stages and that early intervention could prevent permanent damage or death. They learned to identify the pale, numb fingers and toes that indicated first-stage frostbite, and understood that the hard, white skin of advanced frostbite required immediate aggressive treatment to prevent amputation or fatal complications. Warming techniques for frostbite treatment required careful balance between providing heat and avoiding tissue damage. Medieval prison healers learned that rapid rewarming could cause more damage than gradual temperature restoration. They developed techniques using body heat transfer, where frostbitten extremities were pressed against warm skin on another person's torso or armpit, providing gentle, controlled warming that didn't shock damaged tissues. The availability of warm water for frostbite treatment was usually limited in dungeon conditions, but experienced prisoners learned to create warming solutions using whatever resources they could access. They might warm small amounts of water by holding containers against their bodies, or create warming poultices using heated stones wrapped in fabric. Some prisoners learned to use their own urine as an emergency warming agent, since body temperature liquid could provide immediate relief for frostbitten skin. Understanding circulation restoration was crucial for treating hypothermia and preventing its progression to fatal stages. Medieval prison healers learned massage techniques that could restore blood flow to extremities without causing tissue damage. They discovered that certain pressure points could stimulate circulation, and that rhythmic massage of hands, feet, arms, and legs could help restore warmth and sensation to areas affected by cold exposure. Herbal remedies for cold-related conditions relied on whatever plants prisoners could access through guards, visitors, or prison gardens. Garlic was particularly valued for its warming properties and ability to stimulate circulation. When available, prisoners used garlic both internally as food and externally as poultices applied to frostbitten areas. Other warming herbs like ginger cayenne or mustard seed could provide internal heat and improve circulation when prisoners could obtain them. The treatment of respiratory problems caused by breathing extremely cold air required techniques that prisoners developed through trial and error. They learned to create warming masks using fabric layers that pre-warmed incoming air before it reached their lungs. Some prisoners discovered that certain breathing exercises could help restore warmth to airways that had been damaged by prolonged exposure to freezing air. Improvised heat sources for medical treatment required creativity and careful safety management. Prisoners learned to heat stones using whatever fire sources were available, then wrap them in fabric to create warming devices for treating hypothermia or frostbite. They discovered that heated metal objects, when carefully wrapped, could provide concentrated warmth for treating specific areas of cold injury. Understanding the relationship between nutrition and cold resistance led to dietary treatments that helped prevent and recover from cold-related health problems. Prisoners learned that certain foods could improve circulation and internal heat generation. High-fat foods, when available, provided essential fuel for maintaining body temperature. Spicy foods could stimulate circulation and provide temporary warming effects that helped with recovery from cold exposure. The recognition and treatment of hypothermia required understanding symptoms that indicated dangerous progression toward fatal core temperature loss. Medieval prison healers learned to recognize confusion, drowsiness, and paradoxical undressing as signs of severe hypothermia requiring immediate intervention. They developed warming protocols that involved wrapping victims in shared bedding, providing shared body heat, and attempting to restore consciousness through gentle stimulation. Infection prevention in frostbite cases required understanding how cold damaged tissue became vulnerable to bacterial infection and gangrene. Prisoners learned basic wound care techniques using whatever cleaning agents they could access, understanding that clean frostbite wounds healed better than infected ones. They discovered that certain plants had antiseptic properties and could be used to treat frostbite wounds when traditional medical supplies weren't available. The sharing of medical knowledge became crucial for prison community survival. Experienced prisoners who had survived previous winters often became informal medical teachers, passing along treatment techniques that could save lives when professional medical care wasn't available. This knowledge transfer included understanding which treatments worked, which were dangerous, and how to improvise medical care using limited resources. The most experienced guards developed an almost supernatural ability to read the signs of impending prisoner death. Not from compassion, necessarily, but from the practical understanding that losing valuable captives to preventable cold exposure created administrative headaches, financial losses, and questions from superiors that nobody wanted to answer. Professional jailers who worked winter seasons year after year learned to recognize the subtle indicators that predicted which prisoners were sliding toward hypothermia death, versus those who were merely suffering but likely to survive. They could identify prisoners whose breathing patterns indicated dangerous metabolic slowdown, whose skin coloration suggested circulation failure, and whose behavior changes signaled the onset of severe hypothermia that required immediate intervention. The economic calculations that motivated guard intervention were coldly practical. Dead prisoners couldn't pay fines, work off debts, or generate ransom payments. Prisoners who died before trial created legal complications that required paperwork investigations and explanations to judicial authorities. Guards who lost too many prisoners to preventable deaths might face professional consequences that made keeping inmates alive a matter of career survival. Some guards developed informal triage systems for allocating limited warming resources during severe cold snaps. They learned to identify which prisoners were most valuable to keep alive based on ransom prospects, judicial importance, or administrative convenience. These prioritization decisions often meant the difference between life and death for prisoners who were on the borderline of survival. The most pragmatic guards learned to recognize the early signs of cold stress before it progressed to life-threatening hypothermia. They could identify prisoners who were shivering excessively, moving sluggishly, or showing confusion that indicated dangerous core temperature loss. Early intervention was often much easier and more effective than attempting to save prisoners who had already progressed to severe hypothermia. Resource management by experienced guards involved understanding how to provide minimal assistance that kept prisoners alive without violating regulations or attracting attention from supervisors. They learned which rules could be bent safely when extra straw or fabric could be provided without documentation, and how to time their assistance to avoid conflicts with other guards or administrative oversight. Temperature reading became an informal skill that guards developed through experience with dungeon conditions. They learned to assess cell temperatures by feeling air currents, observing condensation patterns, and noting how quickly their own bodies responded to the cold when making rounds. This environmental awareness helped them predict when prisoner survival would become particularly challenging. The timing of guard interventions often determined their effectiveness. Guards learned that assistance provided before prisoners became severely hypothermic was much more likely to be successful than emergency interventions attempted after prisoners had already progressed to dangerous stages of cold exposure. This meant that the most effective guards maintained constant awareness of prisoner conditions rather than responding only to obvious emergencies. Communication between guards became crucial for coordinating prisoner care during severe weather conditions. Experienced guards would share information about which prisoners were showing signs of distress, which cells were experiencing particularly dangerous conditions, and what resources might be available for emergency interventions. This informal information network often determined which prisoners received life-saving assistance. The guards' own survival needs sometimes aligned with prisoner welfare in ways that created mutual benefit. Guards who needed fires for their own warmth during rounds might position heating sources where they also provided benefit to nearby prisoners. Guards who brought food or drink to sustain themselves during long shifts might share small portions with prisoners as a way of maintaining goodwill and cooperation. Understanding administrative blind spots allowed experienced guards to provide assistance without creating documentation or oversight problems. They learned when supervisors made rounds which activities were monitored carefully and how to time their assistance to avoid conflicts with official policies, while still providing life-saving help to prisoners who needed intervention. Medical knowledge among guards varied widely, but some developed practical understanding of cold-related injuries and treatment techniques. Guards with military experience might understand hypothermia and frostbite from campaign service. Guards with family medical traditions might possess folk remedy knowledge that could help treat cold-related health problems in emergency situations. The relationship between guard experience and prisoner survival rates created interesting dynamics, where veteran guards were often more effective at keeping prisoners alive than newer guards who followed regulations strictly. The institutional knowledge possessed by experienced guards often made the difference between dungeons with reasonable survival rates versus those where winter mortality was catastrophically high. Recognition of prisoner value sometimes led to preferential treatment that significantly improved survival prospects for certain inmates. Guards might provide extra attention to prisoners whose families had demonstrated ability to pay bribes, whose political connections might lead to guard advancement, or whose skills might be useful for prison maintenance and operations. When your survival depends on generating heat in a place where heat sources are forbidden, prisoners became remarkably ingenious engineers, creating warming devices from trash-broken pottery and smuggled materials that transformed useless debris into life-saving tools that guards either couldn't detect or chose to ignore. The most basic improvised heat source involved using body heat more efficiently through thermal mass devices. Prisoners learned to collect smooth stones from cell floors or courtyard areas, then warm these stones against their bodies during any periods of physical activity or when fires were briefly available. These heated stones could then be wrapped in fabric and used as portable warmth sources that retained heat for hours, providing focused warming for hands, feet, or core body areas. Metal objects, when prisoners could obtain them, became highly valued components of improvised heating systems. Small pieces of iron or other metals could be heated using any available fire source, then carefully wrapped and used as concentrated heat sources. Prisoners learned to heat metal spoons, nails, or wire fragments, understanding that metal retained and conducted heat differently than stone, but could provide more intense warming for shorter periods. The creation of crude heat exchangers required understanding basic thermal dynamics that prisoners developed through experimentation. They learned to create double-walled containers using nested pottery or metal vessels, where warm air or heated objects could be placed in the inner container, while the outer container provided insulation and safety. These devices allowed them to capture and concentrate heat more effectively than simple direct warming methods. Friction-based heat generation became a survival skill that prisoners refined through practice and innovation. They learned to create friction heating devices using fabric rope or other fibrous materials that could generate warmth through rapid rubbing or spinning motions. While this technique required significant energy expenditure, it could provide emergency warming when other heat sources weren't available. The use of combustible materials for heat generation required extreme caution and secrecy, since unauthorized fires were strictly forbidden and could result in severe punishment or execution. However, some prisoners learned to create tiny brief fires using smuggled flint steel or other fire-starting materials. These fires might last only minutes and required careful fuel management, but they could provide critical warming during the most dangerous cold periods. Body heat concentration techniques involved using available materials to create more efficient thermal management systems. Prisoners learned to create crude heat reflectors using polished metal surfaces or smooth stones that could redirect their own body heat back toward them more effectively. They discovered that certain materials could be arranged to trap and concentrate warm air around specific body parts. The modification of existing objects into heating devices required creativity and basic engineering understanding. Prisoners might modify pottery vessels to create crude heat storage containers or reshape metal objects to create better heat transfer devices. They learned to combine different materials to create composite heating tools that were more effective than their individual components. Understanding thermal conductivity helped prisoners make better choices about which materials to use for different heating applications. They learned that different substances transferred stored and released heat in different ways, allowing them to select the best materials for specific warming needs based on availability and safety considerations. Group heating projects involved coordinating multiple prisoners to create shared warming devices that benefited entire cell populations. These might include collaborative collection and preparation of heating materials, shared responsibility for maintaining heating devices, and group efforts to create thermal management systems that improved survival conditions for everyone. Safety management for improvised heating devices was crucial for preventing accidents that could be fatal in prison conditions. Prisoners learned to test heating devices carefully to avoid burns fires or toxic fumes that could be dangerous in enclosed spaces. They developed safety protocols for handling heated objects and managing the risks associated with improvised heating systems. Concealment techniques for heating devices protected prisoners from punishment, while allowing them to maintain life-saving warming tools. They learned to disguise heating devices as innocent objects, hide them in clothing or bedding, and coordinate with cellmates to conceal evidence of unauthorized heating activities from guards during inspections. The trading and sharing of heating materials created informal economies where prisoners exchanged resources, knowledge, and services related to heating device construction and maintenance. Prisoners who became skilled at creating effective heating devices might trade their expertise for food protection or other survival resources. Seasonal adaptation of heating techniques required understanding how different weather conditions affected the effectiveness and safety of various improvised heating methods. Techniques that worked during mild cold might be inadequate or dangerous during severe weather, requiring prisoners to adjust their heating strategies based on changing conditions throughout the winter months. The moment when grey dawn light filters through whatever opening serves as your cell's window becomes the most crucial transition of each day, not because it signals freedom, but because it marks the beginning of a careful restoration ritual that determines whether you've survived another night without permanent damage to your body or mind. The morning assessment begins before you even attempt to move, as experienced prisoners learn to take inventory of their physical condition, while still wrapped in whatever warmth they've managed to preserve through the night. You start by trying to wiggle fingers and toes, testing whether sensation has returned to extremities that may have gone numb during the coldest hours. The tingling pain of returning circulation is actually welcome because it means your body parts are still alive and functional. Working feeling back into frozen limbs requires a careful, graduated process that prisoners develop through trial and error. Sudden movement of severely cold, stiffened joints can cause injury, so the morning ritual involves slow, gentle flexing that gradually restores mobility to hands, feet, arms, and legs. Prisoners learn to start with tiny movements, barely perceptible, finger twitches and toe curls, then slowly increase the range of motion as sensation and flexibility return. The breathing restoration routine helps clear airways that may have been affected by hours of breathing extremely cold air. Prisoners learn to take deep, careful breaths that warm and moisten respiratory passages, often covering their mouths and noses with fabric to help warm incoming air. Some develop specific breathing exercises that help restore normal respiratory function after a night of shallow conservation breathing. Assessment of shared sleeping arrangements requires checking on cellmates who may not have survived the night or who may need assistance restoring circulation and mobility. The morning check becomes a crucial part of group survival protocols, where each person's condition is evaluated and assistance provided to anyone showing signs of serious cold damage or hypothermia. Bedding management in the morning involves the careful preservation and reorganization of whatever materials provided warmth during the night. Prisoners learn to shake out and air-dry straw bedding that may have absorbed moisture from breath and body heat reposition, fabric layers that may have shifted during sleep, and reorganize shared bedding systems to maximize their effectiveness for the following night. The restoration of clothing layers requires systematic attention to garments that may have become damp, displaced, or inadequately arranged during sleep. Prisoners learn to adjust their layering systems for day activities while preserving the thermal organization that will be crucial when night returns. This might involve repositioning fabric layers, wringing out damp items, or redistributing shared clothing resources. Food and water consumption in the morning require strategic timing that balances the need for energy to restore normal body function with the conservation of resources for internal heat generation throughout the day. Prisoners learn to eat small portions that provide energy for morning restoration activities while preserving the majority of their rations for evening heat generation, when cold exposure is most dangerous. The psychological restoration routine helps prisoners maintain mental resilience after nights that may have tested their will to survive. Morning rituals often include prayer meditation or mental exercises that help process the experience of surviving another potentially deadly night while preparing mentally for the challenges of the coming day and night. Circulation restoration techniques become essential morning activities that help ensure blood flow has returned to normal patterns after hours of careful positioning and thermal management. Prisoners learn massage techniques, gentle exercise routines, and positioning strategies that help restore healthy circulation to areas that may have been compromised by cold exposure or restricted sleeping positions. Damage assessment involves carefully checking for signs of frostbite, chilblains, or other cold-related injuries that may have developed during the night. Prisoners learn to recognize the warning signs of tissue damage and understand which injuries require immediate treatment versus those that will heal naturally with proper care and warmth. The preparation for day activities requires reorganizing personal resources and sleeping areas to protect them during periods when guards make rounds, or when prisoners might be required to leave their cells. This involves securing heating devices, protecting bedding materials, and organizing survival resources to prevent theft or confiscation. Communication with cellmates about the night's experiences helps share information about what survival techniques worked effectively, which problems developed, and how sleeping arrangements might be improved for better survival prospects during the following night. This debriefing process becomes part of the continuous improvement of group survival strategies. The morning light, however dim and grey, provides psychological benefits that help prisoners maintain hope and motivation for continued survival efforts. Even the small increase in visibility and warmth that comes with dawn can provide crucial mental support that helps sustain the will to continue implementing demanding survival techniques for another day and night. The prisoners who lived through multiple winters in medieval dungeons developed something more valuable than any ransom or political connection: a complete survival philosophy that transformed their understanding of what it means to be human, when everything comfortable and familiar has been stripped away, leaving only the elemental challenge of staying alive through one more frozen night. These veteran survivors understood that successful dungeon survival wasn't just about learning individual techniques for warmth, food management, or shelter. It was about developing a comprehensive worldview that could sustain both body and spirit through conditions that would break unprepared minds, as surely as they would freeze unprepared bodies. They learned to see survival not as a temporary emergency response, but as a complete way of living that required constant attention, absolute pragmatism, and unexpected sources of meaning. The mental framework that sustained long-term survivors involved accepting the reality of their situation completely while maintaining hope for eventual change. They learned to find satisfaction in small victories, successfully warming a cellmate's frostbitten fingers, creating a slightly more effective bedding arrangement, or simply waking up alive after a particularly brutal night. These tiny triumphs became the foundation of psychological resilience that could sustain them through months or years of conditions that would seem impossible to endure. Resource consciousness became so deeply ingrained in veteran survivors that they automatically evaluated every object, every scrap of food, every moment of warmth for its potential survival value. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of their environment, noticing changes in air pressure that predicted weather shifts, detecting temperature variations that indicated the best sleeping spots, and reading the behavior of guards and cellmates to predict opportunities or dangers. The social skills that long-term survivors developed transformed them into informal leaders who could organize group survival efforts with remarkable efficiency. They understood that individual survival often depended on group cooperation, and they became skilled at managing the complex social dynamics that could mean the difference between effective teamwork and destructive conflict among desperate people competing for limited resources. Physical adaptation went beyond simple tolerance for cold veteran survivors, developed enhanced circulation, improved cold resistance, and refined body awareness that allowed them to manage their thermal regulation with impressive precision. Their bodies learned to function efficiently on minimal nutrition while maintaining the energy needed for survival activities, and they developed pain tolerance that allowed them to function effectively despite constant discomfort. The philosophy of acceptance that sustained veteran survivors involved understanding that suffering was inevitable, but that their response to suffering remained under their control. They learned to separate physical discomfort from psychological despair, maintaining mental clarity and decision-making ability even when their bodies were pushed to the limits of endurance. Time management became a crucial survival skill, as veterans learned to organize their days and nights around the rhythms of survival rather than external schedules. They developed internal timing systems that helped them coordinate group activities, ration resources effectively, and maintain the vigilance required for preventing hypothermia deaths during the most dangerous hours. The spiritual development that many veterans experience wasn't necessarily religious in conventional terms, but involved a profound connection to the basic processes of life-breathing circulation, warmth, nourishment that most people take for granted. This connection provided meaning and purpose that helped sustain motivation for survival, even when external circumstances seemed hopeless. Understanding the cycles of despair and hope became crucial knowledge for long-term psychological survival. Veterans learned to recognize when they or their cellmates were entering dangerous periods of depression or hopelessness, and they developed intervention strategies that could restore motivation and survival discipline before psychological breakdown led to physical collapse. The teaching role that veteran survivors often assumed became an essential part of their own psychological health. Sharing survival knowledge with newcomers provided purpose and social connection that helped veterans maintain their own morale while improving overall survival rates for entire prison populations. Knowledge of seasonal patterns allowed veterans to prepare mentally and physically for the predictable challenges of each part of the winter cycle. They understood when to conserve resources, when to take risks, and how to pace their survival efforts to maintain effectiveness throughout extended periods of extreme conditions. The acceptance of mortality that veteran survivors developed wasn't fatalistic resignation, but realistic understanding that death was always possible, which paradoxically freed them to focus completely on the survival activities that could prevent it. This psychological clarity eliminated the mental energy wasted on denial or false hope, allowing complete focus on practical survival measures. The prisoners who lived through multiple winters in medieval dungeons developed something more valuable than any ransom or political connection, a complete survival philosophy that transformed their understanding of what it means to be human when everything comfortable and familiar has been stripped away, leaving only the elemental challenge of staying alive through one more frozen night. These veteran survivors understood that successful dungeon survival wasn't just about learning individual techniques for warmth, food management, or shelter. It was about developing a comprehensive worldview that could sustain both body and spirit through conditions that would break unprepared minds as surely as they would freeze unprepared bodies. They learned to see survival not as a temporary emergency response, but as a complete way of living that required constant attention, absolute pragmatism, and unexpected sources of meaning. The mental framework that sustained long-term survivors involved accepting the reality of their situation completely while maintaining hope for eventual change. They learned to find satisfaction in small victories, successfully warming a cellmate's frostbitten fingers, creating a slightly more effective bedding arrangement, or simply waking up alive after a particularly brutal night. These tiny triumphs became the foundation of psychological resilience that could sustain them through months or years of conditions that would seem impossible to endure. Resource consciousness became so deeply ingrained in veteran survivors that they automatically evaluated every object, every scrap of food, every moment of warmth for its potential survival value. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of their environment, noticing changes in air pressure that predicted weather shifts, detecting temperature variations that indicated the best sleeping spots, and reading the behavior of guards and cellmates to predict opportunities or dangers. The social skills that long-term survivors developed transformed them into informal leaders who could organize group survival efforts with remarkable efficiency. They understood that individual survival often depended on group cooperation, and they became skilled at managing the complex social dynamics that could mean the difference between effective teamwork and destructive conflict among desperate people competing for limited resources. Physical adaptation went beyond simple tolerance for cold veteran survivors, developed enhanced circulation, improved cold resistance, and refined body awareness that allowed them to manage their thermal regulation with impressive precision. Their bodies learned to function efficiently on minimal nutrition while maintaining the energy needed for survival activities, and they developed pain tolerance that allowed them to function effectively despite constant discomfort. The philosophy of acceptance that sustained veteran survivors involved understanding that suffering was inevitable, but that their response to suffering remained under their control. They learned to separate physical discomfort from psychological despair, maintaining mental clarity and decision-making ability even when their bodies were pushed to the limits of endurance. Understanding the cycles of despair and hope became crucial knowledge for long-term psychological survival. Veterans learned to recognize when they or their cellmates were entering dangerous periods of depression or hopelessness, and they developed intervention strategies that could restore motivation and survival discipline before psychological breakdown led to physical collapse. But winter dungeons created ethical dilemmas that went far beyond simple imprisonment, particularly when the justice system itself became entangled with the deadly mathematics of seasonal survival. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the impossible situation faced by medieval executioners, whose professional duties required them to kill condemned prisoners who might freeze to death before their official execution dates. The timing of executions became a complex calculation that balanced legal requirements, public spectacle needs, and the practical reality that prisoners might not survive long enough to face their intended punishment. Executioners found themselves in the bizarre position of sometimes needing to keep condemned prisoners alive long enough to kill them properly, creating a twisted form of medical care that served the requirements of justice rather than mercy. Some executioners developed surprisingly sophisticated understanding of hypothermia prevention, specifically to ensure that condemned prisoners remained healthy enough for execution. They learned to recognize the signs of dangerous cold exposure and would sometimes provide additional warmth food or medical attention to prisoners whose deaths needed to be public and official, rather than private and natural. The legal complications created by winter deaths of condemned prisoners required administrative solutions that revealed the dark pragmatism of medieval justice systems. Courts had to determine whether a prisoner who died of cold before execution had technically served their sentence, whether their property could be confiscated as planned, and whether their families bore the same social stigma as families of executed criminals. Public execution schedules often had to be adjusted based on weather conditions and prisoner survival prospects. Executioners learned to assess whether condemned prisoners could survive transport to execution sites, whether public crowds could safely gather in winter conditions, and whether the execution itself could be carried out effectively in freezing weather that might interfere with the intended methods. The psychology of executioners was complicated by their role as unwilling protectors of prisoners they were destined to kill. Some executioners developed professional pride in keeping condemned prisoners alive and healthy, specifically so that their eventual deaths would be more impactful and serve the deterrent purposes that justified public execution. This created twisted relationships where executioners became invested in prisoner welfare for entirely practical reasons. Seasonal execution planning became a specialized skill that experienced executioners developed through years of managing the intersection between weather prisoner health and judicial requirements. They learned to coordinate with courts guards and administrators to ensure that execution schedules aligned with prisoner survival prospects and weather conditions that would allow for effective public spectacle. The treatment of condemned prisoners during winter months often differed significantly from treatment of other inmates, specifically because their deaths needed to be controlled and official. Some condemned prisoners received better food, warmer clothing, or additional medical attention that was designed to preserve them for execution rather than extend their natural lives. Different types of execution methods were affected differently by winter conditions, requiring executioners to adapt their techniques based on seasonal challenges. Hangings might be delayed by frozen ropes or platforms, beheadings complicated by executioners whose hands were too cold for precision, and burnings affected by wind and weather conditions that could interfere with the intended spectacle. The social dynamics between executioners and condemned prisoners created unique relationships where professional duty conflicted with human sympathy. Some executioners developed genuine concern for prisoners whose survival they were responsible for maintaining, while others maintained emotional distance that allowed them to perform their duties without psychological conflict. Historians still debate how widespread these winter execution dilemmas actually were, versus how often courts simply allowed natural deaths to substitute for official executions. The administrative records suggest that winter mortality among condemned prisoners was high enough to create significant legal and practical problems for medieval justice systems. When plague outbreaks coincided with brutal winter seasons, dungeons became laboratories of impossible choices where prisoners faced the ultimate survival dilemma risk, almost certain death from disease by sharing warmth with infected cellmates, or face equally certain death from hypothermia by maintaining the isolation that might prevent contagion. The deadly mathematics of plague-winter overlap created scenarios that tested human decision-making beyond reasonable limits. Plague spread through close-contact shared breath, and contaminated materials exactly the same conditions that prisoners relied upon for winter survival through group warming, coordinated breathing, and shared bedding systems. Every survival technique that could save them from freezing to death simultaneously increased their risk of contracting disease that killed with even greater certainty. Different types of plague created different risk calculations that prisoners had to evaluate under extreme stress, while making life or death decisions with incomplete information. Bubonic plague might be less contagious through casual contact, but more deadly once contracted, while pneumonic plague spread rapidly through the air, but might be survivable with proper care. Prisoners learned to recognize plague symptoms and had to decide whether to isolate infected cellmates or continue sharing warmth that might save everyone from hypothermia. The progression of plague through prison populations created constantly changing survival scenarios, where prisoners had to repeatedly reassess their strategies as conditions evolved. Early in an outbreak, healthy prisoners might choose isolation to avoid infection, but as winter deepened and hypothermia became more threatening, the balance of risks might shift toward accepting disease exposure in exchange for shared warmth necessary for survival. Guards faced their own impossible dilemmas when managing plague outbreaks during winter conditions. Isolating infected prisoners might prevent disease spread but could guarantee death from hypothermia. Maintaining group housing might slow plague progression through better general health, but could ensure that disease spread to every prisoner in the facility. Some guards developed rotation systems that attempted to balance infection control with survival needs. Medical knowledge during plague-winter combinations was primitive, but prisoners and guards learned practical techniques through tragic experience. They discovered that certain isolation methods could provide some disease protection while still allowing limited heat sharing. They learned to recognize which plague victims were most contagious and needed complete isolation versus those who might safely participate in modified group warming arrangements. The psychological impact of choosing between plague and hypothermia created mental stress that often determined survival outcomes regardless of which physical threat prisoners faced. The constant decision-making required to balance competing mortal risks exhausted prisoners' mental resources and decision-making capabilities, leading to poor choices that increase mortality from both causes. Resource allocation during plague winter scenarios required impossible prioritization decisions about food, fuel, and medical attention. Limited warming materials had to be distributed between healthy prisoners who needed them for hypothermia prevention and sick prisoners who needed them for fever management and recovery. Food had to be rationed between healthy prisoners who needed calories for heat generation and sick prisoners who needed nutrition for fighting disease. Some prisoners developed innovative approaches that attempted to minimize both plague and hypothermia risks simultaneously. They created partial isolation systems using fabric barriers that allowed some heat sharing while reducing disease transmission. They developed hygiene protocols that cleaned shared bedding and breathing spaces to reduce infection risks while maintaining group warming effectiveness. The seasonal timing of plague outbreaks affected survival strategies in ways that prisoners learned to anticipate and prepare for. Early winter plagues might be managed through isolation if enough warming resources were available, while midwinter outbreaks required more sophisticated balancing of risks. Late winter plagues might be survivable through isolation if prisoners had enough stored resources to maintain warmth independently. Different plague strains required different survival approaches that prisoners learned to recognize and adapt to. Some diseases spread rapidly, but burned out quickly, allowing for brief isolation periods followed by return to group warming. Others created chronic conditions that required long-term modification of survival strategies to accommodate sick cellmates who needed ongoing care. Winter escape attempts created the ultimate paradox of medieval imprisonment. The season that made dungeons most unbearable also provided the perfect cover for desperate prisoners willing to trade the certainty of slow death by freezing for the possibility of quick death by exposure while attempting to reach freedom that might not exist. The tactical advantages of winter escapes were considerable for prisoners who could survive long enough to exploit them. Snow-muffled footsteps and covered tracks shorter daylight hours provided extended darkness for movement, and severe weather often reduced guard patrols and security vigilance. Storm conditions could provide cover that made escape detection nearly impossible, while frozen moats and rivers created pathways that were impassable during other seasons. But these same advantages came with survival challenges that turned escape attempts into elaborate suicide missions, requiring extraordinary preparation and luck. Escaped prisoners faced immediate hypothermia risks that could kill them within hours of leaving their cells, while the physical weakness caused by prison conditions made them poorly equipped for the strenuous activity required to reach safety through winter landscapes. The planning required for winter escapes went far beyond simple lock-picking or guard evasion. Prisoners had to solve complex logistical problems about clothing, food, shelter, navigation, and cold weather survival that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen. They needed to acquire adequate clothing for winter travel, accumulate food supplies for extended journeys, develop knowledge about safe shelter locations, and understand navigation techniques that worked in snow-covered terrain where landmarks were obscured. Successful winter escapees often spent months preparing their attempts, carefully accumulating resources and knowledge, while maintaining the group cooperation necessary for dungeon survival. They had to balance their escape preparations with their survival needs, ensuring that their planning activities didn't compromise their ability to survive daily prison conditions while working toward their eventual freedom attempt. The psychological motivation required for winter escape attempts reflected a level of desperation that pushed prisoners beyond normal human decision-making. Choosing to attempt escape during winter meant accepting that failure would likely result in death from exposure, rather than simple recapture and punishment. This created a mental threshold that eliminated casual escape attempts, and ensured that only the most determined prisoners would attempt winter breaks. Group dynamics around escape attempts created complex social challenges within prison populations, where cooperation was essential for everyone's daily survival. Prisoners planning escapes had to decide whether to include cellmates who might improve their chances but would require additional resources, or to attempt solo escapes that didn't risk other lives but reduced their own survival prospects. The routes available for winter escapes required specialized knowledge about seasonal landscape changes that few prisoners possessed. Rivers that provided convenient escape routes during warmer months might be frozen solid, creating new pathways, but also eliminating water sources. Forest areas that offered concealment might become impassable due to snow accumulation, while open areas that were dangerous during other seasons might become feasible travel routes when covered with snow. Supply acquisition for winter escapes required careful theft and accumulation of materials that could easily be detected by guards conducting routine searches. Escapees needed extra clothing, food that wouldn't spoil in cold conditions, tools for creating emergency shelter, and fire-starting materials, all of which were contraband that could result in severe punishment if discovered before the escape attempt. The timing of winter escape attempts required understanding weather patterns and seasonal conditions that could predict the best windows of opportunity. Prisoners learned to recognize when severe storms would provide maximum cover, when guard routines might be disrupted by weather conditions, and when they would have sufficient physical strength to attempt the demanding travel required to reach safety. Navigation challenges during winter escapes were enormous for prisoners who might have limited geographical knowledge and no access to maps or navigation tools. They had to rely on basic understanding of terrain, weather patterns, and seasonal landmarks to find their way to populated areas where they might find shelter or assistance. The stories that emerged from successful winter escapes became legends that sustained hope in dungeons across medieval Europe, whispered from prisoner to prisoner like prayers, made flesh tales of impossible journeys through frozen landscapes where desperate souls found freedom through sheer force of will and ingenuity that transformed ordinary people into mythical figures. One chronicle tells of a French knight imprisoned for political reasons who escaped during a blizzard so severe that guards couldn't see beyond their torches. He had spent 6 months preparing slowly accumulating rags that he wove into rope, collecting food scraps that he preserved in the cold, and befriending a rat whose behavior taught him to predict weather changes. When the perfect storm arrived, he used his rope to descend from a tower window into snow so deep it cushioned his fall and immediately buried his tracks. The knight's journey to freedom took 9 days of travel through forest, where snow reached his waist and temperatures dropped so low that his breath froze into ice crystals that cut his face. He survived by following deer trails that led to stream beds, where he could break ice for water by creating snow caves using techniques he improvised based on stories heard from northern soldiers, and by rationing his hoarded food so carefully that he consumed exactly 3 small portions each day until he reached a monastery that provided sanctuary. Another legend speaks of a merchant's daughter imprisoned for debt, who escaped by convincing guards she had died of plague, lying motionless and cold for hours, until they removed her body for burial outside the castle walls. She had trained herself to slow her breathing and heart rate through meditation techniques learned from a cellmate who claimed knowledge of Eastern mysticism, and she had deliberately made herself appear diseased by using techniques that created fever-like symptoms without actual illness. Once outside, she faced a winter landscape wearing only a burial shroud and whatever rags she had hidden beneath it. Her survival depended on reaching her family's secret cache of emergency supplies hidden in a forest shelter that might not even exist anymore. She travelled only at night, navigating by stars her father had taught her to read sleeping during the day. In snow shelters she dug with her bare hands and eating bark, pine needles, and anything else that might provide minimal nutrition. The most remarkable escape stories involved group attempts where multiple prisoners coordinated elaborate plans that required perfect timing and mutual trust. One tale describes 5 prisoners who spent an entire autumn digging a tunnel through frozen ground, working in shifts during the brief periods when guards were elsewhere disposing of dirt. by mixing it with cell straw that was changed regularly and creating supports from smuggled wood scraps to prevent tunnel collapse. Their escape route led under the castle walls and emerged near a river where they had previously arranged for stolen boats to be hidden under ice and brush. The escape itself took place during a winter festival, when guards were distracted by celebrations, and all 5 prisoners successfully reached the tunnel entrance, simultaneously crawled through the narrow passage in complete darkness, and emerged into a snowstorm that provided perfect concealment for their river journey. The survival techniques that successful escapees developed often exceeded the knowledge of professional outdoorsmen born from desperation that pushed human ingenuity beyond normal limits. They learned to read landscape features that indicated underground springs that wouldn't freeze completely to identify trees whose inner bark provided emergency nutrition, and to create fire using friction methods that worked even with damp materials in sub-freezing conditions. Some escape stories became so legendary that they attracted embellishment that made them seem supernatural, but the core elements revealed genuine survival innovations that demonstrate remarkable human adaptability. These tales describe prisoners who learned to travel across snow without leaving tracks, to predict weather changes by reading cloud formations and animal behavior, and to find or create shelter in conditions that should have been fatal. The psychological impact of successful escape stories on remaining prisoners was enormous, providing hope and motivation that could sustain survival efforts through seemingly impossible conditions. These stories proved that freedom was possible even from the most secure prisons and the most deadly conditions, giving prisoners concrete examples of successful survival techniques and escape strategies that could be adapted to their own situations. The sharing and retelling of escape stories became an essential part of prison culture that served multiple survival functions. These tales provided entertainment during long dark hours, taught practical survival techniques that could be useful for daily dungeon survival, as well as escape attempts, and maintained morale by demonstrating that human ingenuity could overcome even the most impossible odds. Now, as these remarkable tales of human resilience and ingenuity settle into your consciousness, let them carry you gently toward rest. These stories of survival against impossible odds remind us that within every person lies the capacity for extraordinary courage, brilliant innovation, and unbreakable determination. Even in the darkest dungeons of medieval Europe, people found ways to preserve hope, to care for one another, and sometimes even to achieve the impossible dream of freedom. Tonight, surrounded by the comfort and safety of your modern world, you can appreciate the simple miracle of warmth, the blessing of security, and the gift of peaceful sleep. The echoes of these ancient survival stories whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that every comfortable night's rest is a luxury that countless generations could barely imagine. Let that gratitude and the inspiration of human resilience carry you gently into dreams where the cold cannot reach you, where warmth surrounds you, and where morning always comes wrapped in light and hope. Sleep well, knowing that you carry within you the same indomitable spirit that helped those long ago prisoners survive the impossible, create warmth from nothing, and sometimes even achieve their dreams of freedom. Their stories live on in the quiet strength that sustains us all. The reminder that human beings can endure, adapt, and ultimately triumph even in the face of overwhelming darkness. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.